State of Virginia Monument is southwest of Gettysburg on West Confederate Avenue. West Confederate Avenue, Part 3 Tour Map. The monument was the first of the Confederate state monuments at Gettysburg. It was dedicated on June 8, 1917 and unveiled by Miss Virginia Carter, a niece of Robert E. Lee. Virginia contributed over 19,000 men to the Army of Northern Virginia at Gettysburg, the largest contingent from the 12 Confederate states. Almost 4,500 of these, almost 1 out of 4, became casualties, the second highest state total. State of Virginia Monument at Gettysburg, topped with the statue of Robert E. Lee. The monument stands 41 feet high, with the statue of Lee and Traveler standing 14 feet high. It is the largest of the Confederate monuments on the Gettysburg battlefield, a fitting tribute to the state that provided the largest contingent to the Army of Northern Virginia, its commander, and its name. Lee's figure stands atop the monument astride his favorite horse, Traveler. The statue was created by sculptor Frederick Sievers from photographs and life masks of the general. Sievers even went to Lexington, Virginia to study Traveler's skeleton, preserved at Washington and Lee University. The total cost of the monument was $50,000. Below Lee, as he studies the distant Union lines, are 7 Confederate soldiers. According to the marker at the base of the monument, the group represents various types who left civil occupations to join the Confederate Army. Left to right, a professional man, a mechanic, an artist, a boy, a businessman, a farmer, a youth. The State of Virginia Monument is south of Gettysburg on West Confederate Avenue, 1.1 miles south of West Middle Street Fairfield Road. West Confederate Avenue is one-way southbound. The design, inscription, and placement of this monument was highly controversial and hotly debated by surviving Civil War veterans. In September 2022, the National Park Service did preservation work on the Virginia Memorial in Gettysburg. The project removed an older, worn patina and preserved the statue with a new patina, closer to the original, historical finish. In the years following the Civil War, Robert E. Lee became one of the most memorialized figures of the former Confederacy. Memorials were not just statues and monuments. Well into the 20th century, white Southerners created roads, museums, and books to celebrate Lee's character and accomplishments. But the memorials did not all tell the same story of Robert E. Lee. The memory of Lee changed over time as each new generation rewrote the history of Lee and the Confederacy. For example, some former Confederates argued that Lee was a Confederate to his last breath. Other biographers highlighted Lee's attempts to restore the Union after the Civil War. Between 1865 and the 1930s, memorialists transformed Lee from a Confederate icon to a figure of national unity. The changes in perspectives of Lee were particularly important in the creation of the Robert E. Lee Memorial at Arlington House. Arlington House is one of the more dynamic examples of the changing meanings of Robert E. Lee memorials. The complex relationship between Robert E. Lee and memorials began in Lee's lifetime. He argued against creating Confederate war monuments on battlefields, which would keep open the sores of war. Instead, Lee supported efforts by ladies' memorial associations to mark the graves of Confederate casualties. As regards the erection of such a monument as is contemplated, my conviction is that however grateful it would be to the feelings of the South, the attempt in the present condition of the country would have the effect of retarding, instead of accelerating its accomplishment, and of continuing, if not adding to, the difficulties under which the Southern people labor. All I think that can now be done is to aid our noble and generous women in their efforts to protect the graves and mark the last resting places of those who have fallen, and wait for better times. Lee's death in 1870 inspired former Confederates to begin creating memorials to Lee. As the news spread, families hung black cloth and governments flew flags at half-staff. Former soldiers, politicians, and women's groups immediately formed Lee Memorial Associations in Lexington and Richmond, Virginia, and New Orleans. Each association tried to control the legacy of Lee and his role in the Confederacy. Former Confederate General Jubal Early was the most powerful figure in Lee memorialization. He led Richmond's Lee Monument Association and co-founded the Southern Historical Society. Early was determined to create a pro-Confederate history of the Civil War that vindicated the Southern cause. One contemporary wrote that, "No man ever took up his pen to write a line about the great conflict without the fear of Jubal Early before his eyes." Lee was the central figure of the lost cause because his social status, military exploits, and personality. Southern writers highlighted his reluctance to secession and his family's Revolutionary War experience as proof that the secession movement was well considered. Early presented Lee as unparalleled in his military genius, leading the Army of Northern Virginia to repeated improbable victories against the Union Army. In fact, Early blamed all military defeats on the failures of Lee's subordinate generals or overwhelming material disadvantage. Biographers presented Lee as the ideal Southern gentleman whose impeccable moral virtues were proof of the South's superior associate.